Right, so welcome everybody to this webinar on how to fight dashboard rot. This is a topic that's near and dear to my heart because I think we like to build lots of dashboards, and sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. But I think we can do a lot to figure out how to build better dashboards that are more useful for people, and also to figure out how to keep them from rotting. And so that's what I'm going to be talking about today. First, a little bit of background about me. So I just mentioned, since somebody said that they're from Calgary, so I was in the Canadian Rockies in January. It was very, very cold. And this is a picture from there. This is a gray wolf here licking my face. It was a very interesting story, but I'm going to not get into this too much, but talk more about who I am. So I've been a data visualization researcher, or I was a data visualization researcher for about 20 years. I was at Tableau in industrial research, and before that in academic research for about the same amount of time. And I've been working on topics around data visualization techniques, perception of data visualization. I've worked on pie charts. There's a lot of comments and feelings about pie charts, so I've got some things to say about those, not today, but in general. And then more relevant to today, about communication with data. How do people use dashboards? How do they use data visualization in to communicate, to collaborate, and how does this work within organizational contexts, and when you're not just like dealing with a single data analyst looking at a single chart. And I've been in what's called developer relations here at Observable for about 2 years now, working on all kinds of topics around how to help people figure out how to use Observable and how to build more interesting things with it. And some people might know me from my little blog called eagereyes.org, if anybody remembers what blogs are in this social media time. But it's not very active anymore, but there's a lot of stuff there on all sorts of database topics. So that's just to give you a brief background of who I am. And now what will we talk about today? So there are basically 6 points here that I have that I want to talk about that all relate to this question of like how to prevent and how to sort of fight back against dashboard rot. So yeah, there's my blog there. Thank you. The first one is this question of, should you even make a dashboard? And I will get into this, but the question should always be asked, is this really a dashboard that we're trying to make here, or is this something else? And then building the right dashboard, once you figured out that what you want is a dashboard, you want to figure out, well, what is it actually that you want to build? We'll talk a bit about interaction. I'm not going to go into very deep detail there on this, but there is a lot to be said about interaction. I want to touch on this a little bit. How to manage data updates. I think that's a topic that gets overlooked quite a bit, and I want to talk about this a little bit because I think it's really important. How to maintain your dashboard. This both in terms of like, does it actually serve the right purpose, but also keeping the data from, or keeping basically the whole dashboard from breaking by having a process for how to make sure that things don't go away or change in unpredictable ways. And then sharing your dashboard and tracking usage, because if you don't track if people actually use it, you don't know if they're getting value out of it or if it's broken or not. And then have some Q&A at the end. And actually, what I'm hoping to do is to pause at the end of each of these sections and look for comments, and then talk about them, or questions, and talk about them in context rather than do it all at the end. So you might actually not have much of a Q&A at the end, but mostly do it as part of this whole thing. So that's actually rather what I would do if we can. All right. So let's get to the first section here. Should you make a dashboard? And I'm going to open this with a little quote here. This is from The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, if anybody remembers that. And I'm going to do a very bad British accent here, but there's this scene at the beginning of the first book, I guess, where they tear down Arthur Dent's house, and because they're building a bypass. And this guy, the construction worker, says, well, what do you mean? Why it's got to be built, this bypass? It's a bypass. You've got to build bypasses. And I always think of this in terms of like dashboards, because it's a dashboard. Of course, you build dashboards. That's just what you do. You build dashboards. So why would you not make this a dashboard? Well, should you make a dashboard? I think is a question that you have to ask. And sorry, I'm still kind of cracking up about my bad accent. So dashboards are, of course, a lot of work to build. And the question is always, well, is this actually worth it? Is this something that will work as a dashboard? Or is this something that is more of a one-off? Maybe this is just a question somebody has, and it could just be part of some analysis, or somebody could come back with an answer, and you don't have to build a whole dashboard around it. Because dashboards are often built by default, but then when that's the case, when you're building a dashboard that isn't really, like, that doesn't need to be a dashboard, well, then they end up rotting away unused in some dark corner of your intranet, because nobody actually needed this dashboard as a dashboard. What they needed was something else. And so I think it's always worthwhile to consider alternatives. So one of them, of course, is Observable notebooks. So if you've used notebooks before, you know that you can do a lot of analysis in notebooks, and then you have something that is more report style perhaps than dashboard style. Though as I'm saying this, I'm also thinking of examples where people have built really cool dashboards in notebooks. So you can build dashboards in notebooks too. But what I'm thinking about is more like do a data analysis in a notebook, and then just use that as your response to a request. Or you could write scripts. Maybe it's a shell script, maybe it's a Python script, maybe it's R script, I don't know. Whatever it is, there are lots of tools that give you answers, that give you analyses. And that can be enough. That can be perfectly sufficient. And of course, there I mentioned them, spreadsheets, of course. Spreadsheets are great. Spreadsheets can be very useful. They can give you the information you need. So it's helpful to think about, like, what is it even that you're trying to achieve? And based on that, relative to that, think about what is the cost of building a dashboard versus the alternative. Now, having said that, I'm not saying don't build a dashboard ever, because there are lots of good reasons why you would do it. And so this is a bit of a checklist where I'm trying to come up with sort of like reasons why you should make it a dashboard after all. So if it's for a recurring need and not just for a one-off, then I think it's a good idea to build that dashboard, because you probably want to come back to it, and then often dashboards are a better way to do it. What if multiple people need access to this information? You can, of course, share notebooks, you can share other things, but it's easier to have a dashboard that people can look at, and especially if it's recurring, you want to have that sort of like as a sort of dashboard. And I'm kind of mixing a couple of different concepts here of what a dashboard is, but having that in one place and having it available for multiple people is going to be a good thing. A topic that comes up quite a bit is this idea of a single source of truth, and sort of like, how do you get to your data? And so a dashboard can be that portal for people to get to the data and to know where to find the data that is sort of like the common idea of what the data looks like. And so for that, a dashboard is perfect, and serves its purpose and is easily worth the effort. What if it connects and coordinates multiple data sources? Like if I have several things that need to be connected, I don't know, there needs to be some query between them or whatever, or I'm able to filter one thing by the other thing, then it can be a good reason for having a dashboard, because those are kind of things that people don't often know how to do, or it's a lot of work. So having a dashboard that does it for them, even if it ends up essentially being a table, can be a great thing to have and to do. An important thing, and this is sort of like both a question and something that I'm going to come back to later, is that the data will be kept up to date automatically. So you have to have some sort of like idea of how the data will be kept up to date and how it will be kept from going stale and breaking. But that's going to be important as a question. And then if it requires interaction, of course, you probably want to build it as a dashboard. So notebooks are great. Well, you can actually build interaction into notebooks, but it's a bit harder depending on how you want to lay things out. Or like in a spreadsheet, it's going to be much harder to do interaction there. So you want, or certainly with a shell script, but any kind of interactive thing will be much better on a dashboard. And I'll talk a bit about interaction later. I want to touch on that just a little bit. And then the last one is that a dashboard is really worth it if people will be able, if your users are going to be able to answer unexpected questions. And of course, you don't know that beforehand, or at least you can't be sure, but it can be a really valuable thing where people are able to actually get very different use out of something than what you initially intended. And so that can be really make it worthwhile to do that. I'm going to just briefly look at the questions here to see if there are any comments on this so far. All right. Nobody's pushing back on my list so far. All right, well, good. Let's see how things continue. But so this is my first question. Like, is this even a dashboard? Should this be a dashboard? And then based on this, we have to ask, well, what do we have to build? What is the right dashboard that we should be building? And so for this, the questions to ask, or like the sort of the things to consider are, who will be the users? And this is often a question that I think gets kind of confused, because the people who ask for or who request a dashboard aren't necessarily the same people as the ones who are going to be using it. So they may be the same, but they might be quite different, and you really need to figure that out. And there are often assumptions here, and I'll be talking about assumptions a fair bit, but there's often an assumption made here that even if it's implicit, that can be tricky to kind of figure out and really get to the point of, like, so who is this really for? Is this for the people who are asking for it? Is this for somebody else? Is it for a whole bunch of different people that have different questions, different requirements? And then what tasks are they hoping to accomplish? And this is also a difficult, or more difficult question than it might seem at first, because often when you get a request, people will tell you what they want, but that's not always what they actually need. And I think I'll get to that on a later point here. But basically, what information are they actually looking for? And do you know what data sources are that you can use for that? So if somebody says, well, this is the data that I want, well, where does it come from? Do you know that, where you're going to get that? And are you able to find that and work with that? And then, are all the stakeholders involved in the discussion? Again, the question is often who requests the dashboard and who needs it, and are the people who are going to use it involved in talking about requirements and questions and so on? And are you making assumptions about their needs? And then going back to my previous question, well, why is this a dashboard? Are there existing tools, are there existing dashboards that aren't sufficient, or are there things that you could be using that could just serve this purpose as well? And then, to my point earlier about what task are they trying to accomplish, is does the information that the audience is asking for actually match the task that they're claiming to solve? And this can be quite tricky, because it's often people have like ideas about how they're going to do things, but that might not always be the right way to do things. So it helps to kind of dig into that and really get like make sure that what you're trying to do here isn't just like have somebody give you a checklist or like a list of things to do, but really like ask why are you even doing this, and are you really getting the thing that you're expecting to get. Just looking at the comments here real quick. Yeah, I think this is a good question, a good point here that RJ is making, that do your users have an incentive to keep referencing the data? So yeah, that's a really good question. So is there enough of sort of like a need for this data, and especially on an ongoing basis? So that's the other thing I think that I'm going to keep harping on for dashboards, is that it's really about having these things around and not just like doing it once and not again. So it needs to be useful and usable sort of into the future. And I'll show this one real quick, even though it's just for later. From situations where the dashboards are deemed useful, are they still useful when people don't get how to properly use data? So that's a good question, and this is sort of like a double-edged sword, because there certainly are people who don't know how to use the data how to use data, I guess, in general, and then how to use the particular data that they're being shown, because you might not know what that data means, or you might have assumptions that are wrong. So in that case, and I'll talk about this a little bit later when I talk about interaction. You can add context to data, and I'll show an example later where you can see that to help people with that. And then there's also the flip side of this, which is, well, sometimes people actually do very different things from what you expect with that dashboard. And so I'll tell a quick story about this. So there's a story that I really like from a study that was done a while ago on how people use dashboards in organizations. And they had this dashboard this is a financial institution that has branches. And for each branch, they had data about like how many sales leads they generated and whatever. Like I don't know exactly what kinds of products they were selling, but something like that. Like you get per branch, you have something like this branch had this many leads this month or something like that. And somebody in a small branch was looking at those numbers and saying, well, we're a small branch, but we actually generate a lot of sales leads relative to our size. So what if I wanted to show that information? But that wasn't possible. And so what they were doing is every month they would take those numbers and copy them by hand into a spreadsheet, and then do sort of like a leads per employee or per salesperson or whatever calculation. It's just so that they could show that so relative to the size, they were actually doing really well. But of course, because they were small, they weren't showing up in like the top because they just didn't have as many people doing the work. So it's really interesting to think about like, what is the data that you're showing, and what do people want to do with that data? And that can be quite different. And so I think that's what I keep kind of coming back to say, well, do you know what people actually want to do? And very often that also evolves, because once people have access to the data, they get different ideas about what else they could be doing. And so there's a lot of that sort of like interaction that happens between like, I have an idea for what I want on this dashboard, but then what actually happens with that is going to be a totally different thing. Okay, I'll show one more here real quick, and then I'll move on to the next section. But this is great. I appreciate all the comments and questions. This is great. So yeah, I wonder if the element of discovery would be a valid question to ask too, to allow people to discover new interactions or relationships in the data. Yeah, absolutely. So that's this is always a matter of sort of like the question of, are you presenting data more than doing analysis on the data? And do you know what you expect people to get out of the data? And that can be quite different and unexpected. And so this is where I was talking about this earlier. Like, so what do you often, and you almost always get unexpected uses, but can you foresee some of those, or can you keep track of what they are? And I'll get to this a little bit later when I talk about tracking too, is if people who are using this that you wouldn't expect, well, maybe they get something out that you didn't know, and then you should find out. All right, I'm going to move on to the next section here so that we can keep at least somewhat on time and talk a bit about interaction next. So interaction is one of those things that is sometimes taken as like a given, but I think it's really important to think about interaction as I keep using this term a bit too much now, the double-edged sword. Interaction is a useful thing to have, but it's also a cost. It's a cost of building it, but also it can be a cost of just people using it. So if you expect people to interact and they don't, then they might not get the use that they need or that they would want. But if you don't give them the tools, then they might not be able to get what they want out of it. So I have this quote here from Ben Schneiderman's. It's actually it's a paper from the 90s, 96 or so, and it's not it's called, so this quote here is called the visual information seeking mantra. The paper is called something else. I think it's called the eyes habit. It's a taxonomy of visual information seeking. I forget the exact title of the paper, but it doesn't matter that much. The mantra is They start with an overview first, then zoom and filter, and then details on demand. And so the idea is that you start with the big picture, you get the data first, or like a higher aggregation of the data, then you're able to zoom and filter, and then you add details on demand. And I think that is a good, and I wouldn't call this like the only way to do things. So this isn't like a strict framework for sure, but it is a helpful way of thinking about interaction. So that's why I think this is a good thing to kind of have here and keep in mind. And interaction, of course, gives people ways to make changes on a dashboard, and gives and provides additional information. So it's just some simple things like hover tooltips where you can just like mouse over and you get more information without cluttering up your chart with like numbers and things. And then of course filtering, drilling, selecting, changing date ranges, and so on. But also linking to other resources. So there's this question earlier about how to use the data. If it's a matter of like understanding what the data means, that can be quite helpful, or just giving more context. And there are lots of ways of doing this. There are inputs in observable dashboards or framework, and in notebooks. There's cross-filtering, which I'll show you in a second. And what interaction, of course, does is it leads to more engagement with your dashboard, which in itself isn't really the goal, but it hopefully then leads to more insights as well, because the engagement hopefully leads to people actually digging into the data more and doing more with it and getting more value out of it. And it often leads to these unexpected uses of dashboards. But of course, this also means that it has to be possible. Like my example earlier was like correlating the size of your branch with the number of sales. If you don't have those on the same dashboard, if you don't have means of getting those numbers together, well, then you can't actually do it. But of course, that doesn't mean that static dashboards can't be valuable. They can actually be very useful if they're done well and if they give you exactly what you need. But that's always the kind of the trade-off. So I want to briefly show a couple of examples here, just to show a few simple sort of types of interactions. So this is a hotel reservations example. This is based on I think a synthetic data set of hotel bookings. And it's kind of this classic sort of like dashboard layout where you have some charts. In this case, these are the classic kind of donut charts that are very popular on dashboards. At the top, and you have some numbers, and then you have charts. This is a timeline here of bookings, and then you have the bookings broken down by different things like room types and seasons, and then like timelines over like the summer and the different seasons here, and you can see how those differ. And as I'm mousing over, you can see this is interaction. I can mouse over and I can get numbers, and this is useful because I can see what the bins are here, and I can see what the actual numbers are. And very often you want numbers. Like I understand the need for numbers, but you don't want them all over your charts because they just clutter everything up and make the charts kind of terrible to read. And there's a table at the end here. But it's a lot nicer to have those as additional data. But then here what you can do is you can drill down. So we go from all the bookings into specific subsets or like specific types of bookings, and can then take a look at those and get the information out of that. So this is kind of a classic way of doing interaction. A different example is this one. This is a dashboard of observable plot downloads. And I think this actually is, no, it's not card, I think, but actually maybe it is. We'll see. Because I can mouse over. No, it's not. Okay, so this goes until the end of May. And so this is, I figured out that this was not current because I can just mouse over here and I can see the last date here, which is the end of May, which I'll get to this a little later, but it's very important to know what the data is of your dashboard or the date of the last data update. But what I find interesting about this, so this is static as in terms of like, there's no filters here. But what I really like about this, though it's kind of hard to show here, is that these top numbers here link to different resources. So if I click on this one here, I have to then share a different tab, but this links to the NPM page to show the downloads here and stuff like that. So this gives more information by linking to other sources or other kind of related information. And you can imagine having links here to like information about what the data is and so on. And then a more kind of typical or like more data viz style interaction. So this is a dashboard of mortgage rates over a long period of time. I think this goes over back to the 70s. And there are two different mortgage rates here. One is for a 30-year fixed rate. One is for a 15-year fixed rate mortgage. And you can see how those change over time. But also, you can filter this. So, and I've actually already done this, but you can move this time window around and change how much time you're seeing, and so you can look at this data in more or less detail. And this is more of an analytical kind of approach. It's like almost like more of like a data app, I guess, where you're the application, like this becomes the way to interact with the data rather than being sort of like a dashboard in the typical sense where it's more the presentation of the data, but not as much or as sort of like deep ways of interacting. And then a couple more quick examples here. This is an example done by one of our customers, Simpler Space. It shows the carbon dioxide concentrations in a building. So this is a 3D model here of a building that you can, or an office space, I guess, that you can move around in. And you can see over time, there are different sensors here, and you can move through time here to see how the concentrations change. And so now here I can see some numbers here, but I can also see this in 3D, and I can kind of zoom into this, and I can see, oh, this is like the kind of scroll up here a little bit. This is like that meeting room or whatever where people gather, I don't know, and breathe a lot or whatever at the office, so that they end up using up all the oxygen there. So you can get information about something that is a bit less typical, I guess, because it's not a typical kind of business dashboard, but this is a really interesting way of doing a data application that lets you look into the data. And then also they have some cool features here to change the representation. Like you can have this be a grid rather than a bar. So this is bars, basically. You can make this a grid, you can make this spheres, and then you can kind of resize them and change how many you want to have here. And this is all connected. So all of these sensors show you the same data with some interesting horizon charts here. You get these large kind of overview numbers. Again, overview first, and then you kind of zoom and filter into parts of the data, and then you can kind of look through it and see how this changes over the course of a day, I think in this case, or a couple of days. And then my last example is just to show you a different kind of interaction. This is actually from our documentation. This is a docs page. Sorry, where's my mouse? In the Observable framework docs. And what this shows is a data set that is, let me just clear the filters here real quick. There we go. So this is a data set that was released a while ago that is for taxi rides in New York City over the course of a few days, I think, or a week or so. And so this shows a few of those days. I think it's 3 days or so. It's 1 million, or like maybe 1 day. That is 1 million records here that you can load into the browser fairly easily these days. Even as like part of just a documentation page, not even a dashboard. And what you can do here that I wanted to show is this sort of like interaction between these three views. So this is pickups here on the left, drop-offs on the right, and then below is the distribution over time of days. So this is the hour of the day, and you can filter in any of those. So I can draw a little box here, and then I can look at a certain part of Manhattan here. I don't know my way around that well. I'm guessing this is Times Square here, so I could see, well, these are the pickups around that area perhaps, and then where do people go and what times of the day. So if I then also filter by time of day here and pick a single hour, I can see how this perhaps changes over time. If I pick a slightly longer period, maybe I'll see a bit more. But you can see there's less going on in the early morning, or early morning, I guess, not so early morning, but actually early morning, like past midnight and into like 3 or 4 in the morning. There's still a lot going on here. And then there are these peaks around like midday, and then later in the afternoon. And then if people have been doing some interesting analyses around like the financial district, like where do people go from there in the evening or during the like I don't know during lunch hour to go for like the power lunches and things like that. And so you can get that kind of information, and but the filtering goes across all of these different views. So this is called cross filtering, which is a really interesting way of doing things. All right, so these are just a couple of examples here, or a few examples. And we can share those slides later. I actually have links to all of those and a couple more on this slide here, so you can take a look at those yourselves. And with that, I'm gonna head back to the comments. Okay, that's been a fair amount of commenting. Let me see. Okay. There's a good question here about how to figure out what people actually need. I want to come back to that later because I want to talk about the other things first. All right. Yeah, I'm gonna come back to these other questions a little bit later. I want to move on to my other points here and then do more sort of like general Q&A here. My next point is about managing data updates, and there are two different aspects to this. One is the data itself, and the other one is time. And I think time is actually really important and something that gets overlooked a fair bit. And I have another quote here. This is from Mike Bostock, the founder of Observable. And he says, business decisions often take time to effect. And in that case, it's usually detrimental to make a business decision based on fast-moving data. If it'll take 3 to 6 months to execute a new business strategy, you don't want to base that decision on data that changes every minute. Right? And so this is something that I see a lot, where when you're loading your data, especially in kind of traditional BI tool kind of dashboards, they load the data directly from the database. And so your data is up to date, up to the minute. And that sounds great, but it's not actually that useful because it's very noisy and it can be quite misleading. And we have a blog post. My colleague Alison Horst wrote a blog post about this, about how you want to align your dashboards with the time scale of your actual business needs and business decisions. So I recommend you check that out. But I'll give you a few of those points here in this next slide. So the big question is like, what's the useful frequency of data updates? And the stress here should be useful, really. Because you can always say, well, of course, my data has to be up to date to the second. But very often, that's not actually true. It could be hourly, it could be per minute, it could be like really high frequency in theory, but it's not that common that that's actually the case. More likely, you mostly deal with changes on a daily basis, perhaps, but actually, more likely than that, it's actually weekly. I think that's much more likely than daily. Daily changes probably aren't that important, and you're not going to be able to actually respond to them. And if you respond, the delay of anything that happens to your response is going to be so long that daily isn't going to actually be useful. So more likely it's going to be weekly, it's going to be monthly, it's going to be quarterly. That's why that's why there's reporting on monthly basis, on quarterly basis, because that's where you actually usually have a useful kind of effect on your decision making, and your decisions actually have an impact on the on what's happening and create a response. So yeah, so what's the granularity of your decision making? What does that actually? How do you impact your business? How do you impact whatever you're working on? And what's sort of like the time horizon for that? And the problem is that when you don't match those things up with what the data is showing you, you get incomplete data. And that can lead to confusion. And it's kind of obvious to show this, but it's really something I've seen a fair amount, where people just get misled by the data being incomplete, and then they just make bad decisions, or they make decisions that are just noisy because they just do one thing today and another thing tomorrow because the numbers keep changing, but it's not a change that's meaningful, and it's not meaningful on the time scale that they're actually working on. So here's a little totally made up example. Of course, it's just to illustrate this. But let's say we're looking at sales numbers here over, I don't know what this is, like a month perhaps. And things aren't looking great because they're kind of pointing down at the end. But the month isn't over. And so at this point, this is maybe what your numbers look like. But which is normal because, I don't know, right now, today, we're like halfway through July. So our July numbers aren't going to look great because we're not done with July yet. And so at the end of this period, things might look quite different. So it's really important to know when your data was updated and to only update it when that's meaningful. So perhaps your sales number shouldn't update every day. Maybe they should update every week, every month. Actually, every month should probably be more useful. That doesn't mean you can't look at the data like kind of through the month, but you have to know which of those charts are showing you current data and are inherently noisy. And then also you should probably show them in a way that gives you a sense of where things are going, and not just show them like this, like where as if it's a done month, right? I'm gonna probably move on a little bit so that we can get. I just want to go through my last 2 points, and then I want to go into the discussion again. So this is a really important point, though. I think is to keep track or to be aware of what the time scale is that your data is actually changing at, and not to insist on something like real time or close to real time when it's not helpful and actually is detrimental. And then to a point I made earlier about keeping things sort of going. So you built your dashboard. Now you have to maintain your dashboard. And maintaining it has a few different aspects. So one is you want to check in with your users. So your users might have been happy initially, but they might not be anymore because what they actually wanted was different, or what they need now has changed. And so you need to be able to talk to them and see if they're still actually getting the value that they thought they would get. You want to track usage, and I'll get to that in a second, and on the next point. And you also want to make sure that your data sources keep working and they don't change in unpredictable ways. So ideally, you'd have a process for changes to databases so that everybody knows what's going on. So things don't disappear, so things don't suddenly change under the hood, or I don't know, a thing is still there but it's no longer maintained because the actual thing to look at is a different one, which happens a fair amount in a lot of organizations. So you want to be able to you want to know that, because otherwise your users are looking at the wrong data and that outdated data. I know this is difficult in practice, but I think it's really important to have those communication lines open so that you're aware of those things changing. And then the other thing is to monitor, in this case, the build process, talking about Observable framework, where we have an explicit build process. And when that fails, it can tell you. So you get a notification that says something went wrong. I can't access this database or whatever. You can also build tests into that to make sure that your data actually changes. And if it doesn't change, well, something might be wrong. And this is really important because databases get moved, they disappear, permissions get updated or changed or whatever, things break in lots of different and interesting ways. And you want to make sure that you're aware of that. And traditional BI dashboards, when they just load data from the dashboard, from the database directly, they fail silently. I mean, as far as you as a dashboard creator are concerned, because your users are just staring at an empty screen. And then do they know who to talk to? Do they feel like they are the ones that can complain about that or ask about that? And so that can be another reason for dashboards to just fall into disuse because they're no longer working. And so now people stop using them. Maybe it's just because of a temporary thing, but that can really be the end of a dashboard, which is a lot of work that went into that, and it no longer gets used. And then my last point here is somewhat related to this, which is about sharing and tracking usage. So the first part, of course, is the sharing part. So you want to share with the people who wanted it. And then the other part is that there might be other people who might also get value out of it. And of course, this has to be done within the limits of who has access, who is supposed to get this data. But I think it's helpful to think about who might want to get this data and who would get value from this dashboard. But also to then track if it's several things: tracking usage, if it's being used, how it's being used, who is using it. So yeah, these are the points here. It doesn't even get used. Who is using it, and does that actually, does that happen in the way that you would expect, or does it suddenly drop off? which usually is a sign of issues. People no longer need, like the data doesn't work anymore for some reason that you might not know, or they might need something else now. And so you should be able to see that, but you need to be able to track. Otherwise, you can't tell. And yeah, as I said earlier, you want to follow up with your users and stakeholders to figure out if they're actually still getting use out of it or like value out of it. And of course, Observable has some neat tools for that. So I wanted to show that real quick. So this is our analytics page for the Observable framework projects, where you can see the total usage at the top there of all the pages in a project, and also who's using that or on a regular basis, which I think means at least twice a week. And then see all the pages, individual pages, because you might have this broken out into many different parts, and see which of those get used and which ones aren't, and get information about that. So you get and we have this blog post here that talks about that. So I'm kind of running over here. We're sort of at time here. I think I'm going to keep going for a little bit longer to look at questions and see if there are any more comments that I want to get to. But these are essentially the points that I wanted to talk about. So to fight dashboard rot, should you make a dashboard in the first place? Yes or no? And then you want to build the right dashboard. You want to look at interaction. You want to make sure that you manage your data updates. You want to maintain your dashboard over time, and you want to share it and track usage. So these are kind of the points that I was hoping to get through. All right, and with that, I will take a brief look at the comments again. Okay, so this is a question that might be hard to answer in a sort of a nutshell, but what's your approach or framework to figure out what clients really need? I feel the fact to figure out clients' needs is another subject. Yeah, exactly. So this is a big question. There are a number of approaches that have to do with like how you ask questions and how you get them to get people to sort of like tell you. Basically, I think this has to do with phrasing. Like, it's not so much about like what they want to see, but what do they want to do, and also going through scenarios where you ask them like what are the things that you envision doing with this, and then they will usually tell you a scenario which is more of like what do you do, rather than people telling you the specific database fields they want or the specific numbers they want to see. The other thing is about is to get more people into the whole. Get more people to the table, I guess, so that they can tell you what they want. Because again, if there is like somebody, some VP somewhere that says, I want this thing on this dashboard, but the people who are going to be using that are different, then you need to know what they actually want, who they are, what their questions are, what their needs are. And so getting more people into the fray is helpful, because they will give you more of that information that isn't about specific database fields. This is sort of like my pet peeve about people like insisting on specific things that are very, very fine-grained, but that most of the time actually aren't actually what people really need. And so if you get more people in that actually do the work and that are the people who are going to be the users, those will give you better ideas of what they actually need, and they will have a better sense of the sort of like the usage scenarios. I guess that's what I'm looking for, is the use rather than what's being shown. And this is an interesting question here. Any insights on dashboards accounting for qualitative data? So qualitative data is its own thing to an extent. I mean, of course, it does. It always plays into things like filtering and like categories on in all kinds of like representations. If you mostly have qualitative data, I think that's going to get difficult to. I think if it's mostly qualitative, I'm not even sure I've seen this on a dashboard. That tends to be more of a data analysis thing. If you're talking about like survey data, things like that, I think that's going to be tricky to show that. You can always do, I don't know, the typical like the Likert charts and things like that, but It's a good question. I don't know if I have an answer, but I think the question there is always not so much what's the data, but what is the question? What are the needs? What do people actually try to get out of it? And go from there, and then see what kinds of tools there might be, and like representations there might be that would be useful for that. I'm gonna quickly look through a few more of the questions. Okay, this is a fairly long one, but I think it's a good question. So there's a question about time here. In my experience, people aren't really interested in predicting the future, but either knowing the present, so live dashboards, or the past trend dashboards. I wonder whether this is related to the idea of importance of time, or how we can add something like a classification of dashboards depending on how users are expected to interpret data in relation to time. So if I understand this correctly, I think there is actually, I do think that there is an aspect of modeling that talks about the future that I think is underrepresented in dashboards, because there's a big focus, and I actually wanted to show this and I forgot, but there is, you can also do modeling on dashboards, and that can be quite helpful and I think quite interesting, but because most dashboards are so focused on data, and obviously you don't have the data about the future, they tend to never touch that. But I think that would actually be very helpful. That's why people use not dashboards, but spreadsheets to do modeling. But I think more of that could be done in the context of data. But yeah, so the question here is, I guess, a classification of dashboards depending on how users are expected to interpret data in relation to time. That's a good question. I think there is I think there is this sort of like idea of a pure monitoring dashboard. Like I've seen people do on a production floor, like if you imagine like a large assembly kind of plant where there are lots of stations where things are being assembled. So my concrete example is coming from a car manufacturer, and so they had like all these stations where different things were being done, and they had lots and lots of live data, and they needed to know things like down to the second. Like they really wanted to know what's happening right there, right now, and if something goes wrong, they need to respond like right away, because any minute that any part of that whole plant isn't working, that costs money. So yeah, there are certainly times and situations where you do want data that is very real time and very much down to the minute or the second. But I think those are pretty rare. So in the typical business use case, you can't respond that quickly. You can't just run over to that station and like fix a thing, or like help somebody, like, I don't know, put something back together that broke or whatever, so that they can be up and running again. That's just not how most things work. So I think a lot of business use cases are much more like, we're going to do something, we're going to run a promotion, and the promotion is going to take, it takes a while to spin it up, and then it takes a while for people to respond. And so it takes a month from making the decision to getting the response to it. And so it's just, and then, obviously different things aren't happening in isolation. So they are going to play into each other. And then there are seasonal effects. And so it's not like your data exists in this total vacuum where you can just like make a tweak here and it just like boom, immediately does something. So I think again, I'm not saying that there aren't scenarios where there are people need real time data, but I think they're pretty rare, and when you need that. But the default assumption that I see that we should always see live data, I think is just wrong. I just don't think that that's actually all that helpful. Okay, there's a comment here about AI. Yeah, I was waiting for that, because I was waiting for somebody to say, well, why do we even need dashboards? Why don't we just have like the AI give us the answers? But that's not going to happen anytime soon, as far as I can tell. So there is certainly a role in building dashboards and getting help building dashboards, at least in theory. I haven't seen it being done, but I think there will be probably be some of that work soon. In fact, I'm pretty sure we will see some of that. So the the big data visualization conference, it's called Viz, happens in October, and I would expect there to see some research on that, and we might see some products at some point too. Yeah, this is a good point here too. I want to just briefly show this one, and then I think we should probably wrap up because we're actually kind of over the allotted time here. But spreadsheets are still a helpful tool for data exploration, and yeah, absolutely, in the run-up to building dashboards, and notebooks too. Actually, we should mention notebooks again too. And it can be useful for sharing early concepts with end users, and I think that's a very good idea. So, because if you build something, if you build it out, and then people just don't feel like they can change anything, well, then you just build a thing, and people are like, okay. But hopefully it'll help them, but maybe it won't. But if it's more of a sketch, if it's built in something else in a notebook or in a spreadsheet, so now you're showing them the idea, and now they can tweak it, and you can tweak it together, and so you're going to get much more value out of it that way. So that was also the earlier question about like how do you figure out what people actually want. And so this is one way to do it, is to involve people in the design process and to show them sketches and prototypes. And I think that's a really good way of doing things as well. So that's a really good point. All right. And I think, I'm just getting the signal to wrap up. So thank you all for coming. There's I should very quickly just mention, so there's a little blog post I wrote a little while ago that this is all sort of based on. This was sort of the extended version of that. So I encourage you all to read that. And I think we've shared the link to the blog post and probably also the slides, but those are also available. And I appreciate all you coming to this talk and for the lively discussion and the questions. And I hope you all have a great day. Thank you.